Cool. 3, 2, 1. Rachel Vickery, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Peter. Great to be here.
Awesome. And I probably wanted to set this chat up just like a movie. So we're just going to jump straight to the end point and then we'll backtrack. So
Sure.
how we came to chatting, I have been doing some goal kicking work with the Melbourne Storm, walking along the sidelines, doing our usual kicking stuff. Before getting into the session, I see you standing there, introduce myself, and we have an amazing chat, hence why we've come to get you on the podcast. So I guess to give our listeners a little bit of backstory about what you're doing with the Storm, can you just explain what you're currently doing with the Melbourne Storm?
Yeah, awesome. So just with the Storm, originally got involved with them about 3 years ago. Lachlan Penfold, the head of performance, and I have worked with different sports for about over the last 10 years, between Brisbane Lions and the Roosters and a little bit with Golden State Warriors. And then, so he was very familiar with the work that I've done with athletes with performance under pressure, and specifically a lot of work around breathing. And Storm is one of those organisations that's always looking for edges. They're always looking for how do we get better, where are our performance gains. And I think in professional sport, definitely getting to the point where there's so much already in a training week that coaches are loath to be putting more stuff in it, right? So Lachlan had approached me about doing some work around breathing for performance, both for physical performance, but also for state control, and under that bigger picture umbrella of performance under pressure. So how do we ensure that athletes, when it counts, can execute physically, but also stay in control mentally, emotionally, so that in that awesome performance zone, not losing their shit, not getting over nervous, not making mistakes on field or off field, that's keeping them from being on field, that sort of thing. And the cool thing about breathing work is that athletes have to breathe anyway, right? So it's not like we're putting more stuff into their existing program, which is often already full on. It's just optimizing what they're already doing. And also when we do it well, it certainly helps with their recovery strategies as well. So they're actually able to recover between sessions and recover after games and those sorts of things. So in many ways, it's kind of taking some of the load out of the system so that they're able to back up.
I'm wondering if there is an example that you can share of something that you've brought in and trying to work on, just one thing that is sort of on trend and on topic at the moment.
Without giving away secrets.
Yeah.
I think certainly across the board, you're seeing in a lot of sport, there is a shift to an awareness of breathing and how important breathing is. Often that is looked at from the perspective of, mindfulness or state control or that side of it. I think there's an area and a part of breathing that hasn't been touched so well in many sports, which is actually the physical side of breathing for performance. The difference it can make to a footballer having, the energy in their legs in the back end of that final 10 or 15 minutes of a really tough game, for example. Have they got that extra burst that can they go after that sprint after that, that attempt for try or whatever, or have they got nothing in their lungs or nothing in their legs? So there's the whole physical side, I think, which is where we're really working with the athletes. And they've certainly first season in picked up a lot of the on-field stuff, and now we're starting to shift that further down, so it's coming into training and practice and gym work and off-field and recovery and pre-game and all of those other areas that it's starting to filter down once they've got a really good handle on what they're doing on-field. So certainly a lot more awareness for them about breathing as a reset. So it's what we call a reset breath. So it's very much about, getting air out of their lungs, being able to, recover. Again, it just often will pull them physically present, but also just give them that feeling of, well, I've just done a sprint down the field, I'm gassed, and I need a really quick recovery that I can just get on top of things in 5 or 10 seconds because the game's still happening. So we're probably doing some work in that space. A lot of the stuff that's done at the moment in breathing is what I call a get out of jail card. It's once someone's crossed a red line and they've got stuff showing up, whatever that stuff is, and we can certainly unpack that, further down the chat if you want to. I've got my stuff and it's shut up, and I want to make sure that I can pull myself back under red line. I call that a get out of jail card, right? And they're very helpful strategies. So things like box breathing is a common one, even though that's I had a very interesting conversation with someone around how box breathing actually came about, and it's actually used in its common practice. How it's used is not actually how it was originally designed to be used, so that was quite interesting. We can talk about that if you like.
Can you jump straight into that right now? Can you explain the box breathing?
The box breathing, yeah. So box breathing is something that's often purported to have been something that the Navy SEALs came up with, right? And the whole idea of box breathing is breathing in for 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds, breathing out for 4 seconds, holding for 4 seconds. And it's meant to be a technique that is used when you're starting to hit red line or approximating that either physical performance state or emotional arousal state that you're starting to get to red line. You're starting to kind of cross into, hey, this isn't a sustainable level of physical, mental, or emotional performance. And so it's designed to sort of de-escalate state a little bit. It's being commercialized really by a former SEAL who's kind of made it really popular. But it actually wasn't how it was originally designed. It wasn't designed to be a 4 second in, hold, 4 seconds out. It was actually designed more around a sustained count in for about 6 seconds, out for 8 seconds, and then pause at the end of that. Was sort of, or a version of that is how it was actually designed to use in terms of having best effect on heart rate variability, which is an indicator of physiological stress. So that was kind of box breathing, right? But
why did the Navy SEALs care so much about breathing? What were they trying to get better at or use it for?
Yeah, a lot of that was around de-escalating physiological state, so that redlining, heart rate going through the roof, lactate profiles, starting to really escalate, getting to that point of physically being tapped out. Mentally, sometimes when you cross that line where you're so physically, you're amped, you're operating in what we call sympathetic nervous system or fight and flight nervous system, you've been in there a long time and it's escalating. Sometimes you get to a point where your smart decision brain goes offline, for example, you lose your peripheral vision. Which is where it's obviously really critical on the field for footballers. Smart decision making. Can you actually remember the gameplay that you were taught, that week during the week in the rooms? Is it translating to what you're seeing on field? Now, when you hit that point, then smart decision making goes offline. So you misread situations, you make dumb mistakes, you make silly errors, and obviously in the field for operational special forces, it's life or death stuff. It's not do you win or lose a game. So they invest very heavily ensuring that their special force operators can actually execute really well under pressure, because they're in some of the most demanding environments on some of the most demanding missions, and it's very high stakes, not just for their lives or their teammates, but also potentially multiple thousands of people around them. So it's one of those really critical things that we do as a human. It's almost a hack between when we're operating in that high arousal fight and flight state and being able to ride many of the same reactions into flow state, into that presence, calm, focused, execute really well mentally, emotionally, and also there's a whole physical side of that performance with breathing. So they use it a lot in a lot of their training, but also to a degree use it more as a strategy to calm when already under pressure, rather than where I like to come at things from. I think it's really important to have those get out of jail cards. But as I always say, the most effective get out of jail card is not end up in jail in the first place, right? Because then you don't need them. And so there's a whole lot of stuff that we look to do, especially with, come back to your original question, Melbourne Storm, where we're looking to start to front load stuff. So we're actually trying to delay how far through the game, or how far into a training session, or how up the work capacity can they get to before they start to hit that point and start to have those negative consequences of that.
Now, we'll have people that have either got a training tonight listening to this, or definitely a training tomorrow. What is something that they could do to, again, instead of having to use a get out of jail free card, what is something that they could try, think about, or use, or a tactic that you coach?
Yeah. Okay. Well, probably if we're just going to give them something to use immediately, they're going to need to get out of jail card, right? Because they haven't probably had time to actually work on the other stuff. So if I can put that into a frame for you, we do about 15 to 20,000 breaths in a day, right? It's a shitload of breaths. Yeah, I know, right? And so it really, where you do those 15 to 20,000 is actually more critical for performance than where you do the 1 or 2 or the 5 or 10 or the couple of hundred that you might take in a game or a training session. But of course, athletes want the immediate, I talk about being at the top of the pyramid, right? They want that immediate, quick reaction, quick fix thing. So one of the best sort of thing at the top of the pyramid, get out of jail cards, is actually to focus more on the breath out. A lot of athletes get to that point where, they're feeling gassed and they're sucking for air and they're working really hard and they're trying to pull more air into their lungs. But they get to a point that their lungs are actually so full that no matter how much they try to breathe in, there's physically no space to put the air. But their brain misreads that and says, I can't breathe. So then their body has to make a decision and go, right, I actually need to back off my physical intensity a little bit because my body's giving me this misread that I'm working way harder with my breathing than what I should. So if I, can you see this water bottle?
Yes, I can.
All right. So if we're a good breather, right, and we're breathing really well with the 15 to 20,000 breaths that we breathe, we'll be breathing at the bottom of our water bottle, right, so to speak. We're breathing at the bottom of our lungs with our diaphragms, where we're most efficient to breathe to. So we breathe in and we breathe out, and we breathe in, we breathe out. And you sitting there might need about 5.5 litres of air in and out of your lungs in a minute. It's not a whole lot, right? But when you start to run, the first thing you're going to start to do is you're going to start to breathe a little bit deeper, and then you're going to go a little bit faster. So when you're at the back end of a really intense game, your air in and air out of your lungs might go up to anywhere from 120 to 150 plus litres of air in and out of your lungs in a minute. So it's a huge change. So everything's going to start working really hard, okay? And that's awesome as long as you're already breathing really efficient when you're driving to practice, when you're driving to your game, when you're sitting in the locker room, when you're doing your pre-warm-up stuff. If you're breathing really well at rest, you've got all of the space to go to when you need it, right? So you start running, you're going to start lifting your chest, you're going to start mouth breathing, everything's going to start to go. But if you're already driving to practice, driving to a game, and you're already breathing way at the top of your lungs, which most athletes do if they haven't actually done any sort of breath work before, then when they try to breathe in deeper and harder and faster, they get to a point where like there's no space. Like, does that make sense? So if this water bottle's full of water, can I put more water in here? Right? You can't. It's not rocket science, right? The best way to put more water in here, if I had a glass and I said, right, Peter, this water has to go in there, is you're going to tip some of this water out to make space for this new stuff, right? And our lungs and our breathing is exactly the same. So rather than focusing on the breathe in, the big sucks, the hands above head, they kind of suck the air into the chest, actually you need to focus on getting the air out of your lungs and getting it out so you've made space for the next one. So any opportunity you get between, like if you're doing sprints or runs or anything, you finish your sprint, cross the line, just do a really hard, fast exhale, get the air out. If you're doing any, if you've done any sort of short bursts or you've got any pause, like often in a game, if there's a stoppage in play or, anytime that you get an opportunity, it's actually to think about getting the air out, recovering, slowing things down. The in-breath and everything else is going to take care of itself if you've actually got the space to move into. So one of the things I say is, is when in doubt, breathe out. Like really focus on that out breath phase, and everything else will actually kind of look after itself.
I like that. When in doubt, breathe out. Perfect. It's so applicable to a lot of our audience who are goal kickers. Rugby Bricks, we deal with a lot of goal kickers, awesome. And we often see exactly what you're explaining about the get out of jail free card. Then in that moment, the big breath, we physically can see a goal kicker trying to get some focus. And I think Dan Carter, as you would have watched growing up, the big breath on the big screen. So I suppose in that moment, we should still be using that type of breathing and that calming sort of breath. Is there sort of a cue, like a second count, that is the best way to get that real calming breath if we do need to absolutely use it?
Look, it depends on whether you've practiced or not, right? And so what you basically want to do is just ensure that whatever you're doing in practice is what you're going to use in your game. So often we'll see athletes that don't necessarily practice that same timing of the in-breath, out-breath when they're gassed. Because the reality is if you're just going out to practice kicking, and you're not gassed and you haven't been working hard for 60 minutes, then your whole breathing mechanics is going to be quite different. So this upper chest part's going to be moving differently, okay? Yeah. And so therefore it's all about timing, and this is where we come from, breathing from the biomechanics side of it, right? So all of the muscles that you use to be an upper chest breather are all of the muscles that come through the front of your chest. They come across the back of your shoulders. They're all of kind of these things, okay? And they're lifting really hard to lift everything up and down. And I had a classic example with an NBA basketball player a number of years ago, and he, his free throw percent, and this is the parallels to goal kicking. So I think because it's a closed skill, there shouldn't be a whole lot that theoretically should influence it. A little bit different because of course a free throw is always taken from the same part of the court as opposed to obviously a kick will be different parts of the field. But his free throw percentage in training was high 70s and his game percentage was 22%. He knew, as elite athletes often do, exactly where he needed to position his body, just down to the degree to make sure that he got the shot in, right? It's the reason we practice things over and over and over again. But then when he'd get on the line in a pressure environment, just because of the nerves and the anxiety and all of the head talk, and it was contract year for him, he had girl issues off court, he had fear of what his teammates thought, like he had all this noise going on, and he was now gassed because it's an intense game, so everything was going. Just the change that happened to how he was breathing subtly changed his setup. And you could watch him when you watch him side on the line with his body position would just be a little bit slightly different forward or back. And it would be like a brand new, like he'd never shot a basketball, almost in terms of that accuracy, because his timing would change just a tiny little bit. And so coming back to your question, I think it's just making sure it doesn't really matter so much what you do. Is it consistent? And does it mimic what you would do in a game? Are you mimicking that in practice? So I was watching, I think when you were working down at the Melbourne Storm, it was awesome to see some of the guys who would practice their kicking after they were already gassed because they'd been doing some other drills. They'd just take one attempt, because that was a lot more representative, I guess, of when they're going to be called on to actually use that skill, rather than, hey, I've just gone down to the footy field and I've, spent 30 minutes, 45 minutes in a relatively calm state physiologically, kicking for goal. Yeah. So probably I would suggest that for the guys that are practicing, who are kickers and practicing a skill, make sure that you've actually, even if you do like a couple of laps, if you're doing your own training, make sure that you're a little bit gassed. You might have done a couple of sprints, come in and take 5 attempts, or messing it up a little bit so that you've got that workload of what's happening to timing and breathing and body position and all those things really, really dialed in for accuracy.
That is an exceptional example, because I think one thing that relates to energy as well with goal kicking is at the start of a game where we are excited, heaps of energy on our approach. Sometimes we can get excited and take a really quick, big step, which then affects our kick. And exactly what you're saying is about if our upper body posture is completely different on a fatigue kick to a not fatigue kick, like that's just another detail we might as well control because we can. So perfect.
Absolutely.
Perfect example. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which takes me into my next point I want to talk about, posture. We had a great chat, and I've heard you talk about it a lot, about the guys' posture, but also in other sports. And I heard you explain about swimmers on the side of a pool, how being tall and trying to sort of peacock and parade around and look like an athlete actually isn't that great for breathing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So again, if you kind of come back to that water bottle analogy, right, that I was saying before, is if you're already, breathing up here before you do anything, you've got nowhere to go. Like, you've really shortened your ability to this is called your exercise reserve capacity, meant to be reserved for exercise, not used sitting in a chair having conversation, right? Certainly not used pool deck, certainly shouldn't be being used sitting on the bench waiting to run onto the field, for example, right? So with posture, what you often see is you see this, like, chest out, big shoulders, all this breathing kind of up here. And often what we see, and I used to think it was a female athlete thing, having come from a lycra sport myself, where there's a lot of pressure, of course, gymnastics is a body image sport. There's a lot of pressure to, when you're out there in lycra, to hold your tummy in, you got to kind of got your core locked on because you don't want to look like you got a gut. Think about what's happened with rugby jerseys over the years. They've changed from these big baggy, you can hide anything in that, to like these slim fitting, like they're almost like lycra, right?
Even just at the gym for general public walking around trying to, intimidate. Exactly.
It's amazing, right? And so it's amazing how people kind of like want to, suck in their stomach just to hold in their gut. And it almost gets, especially in contact sports, right, where you're bracing for impact a lot of the time, you get quite used to having your core locked on all the time. Now, when your core is locked on around your lower part of your rib cage, if you try it now, if you put your hands on your lower rib cage, and your listeners at home can actually do this as they do it, but if you put your hands on your lower rib cage and you just try to breathe normally through your nose and feel the air come down into the bottom part of your lungs, you should be able to feel that move a little bit. Okay.
Yep,
so that's kind of optimal diaphragmatic breathing down there. Okay. Now, if you then tighten your abdominals like as hard as you can, like brace them and keep them braced and try to get that same movement, you can't do it, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So your brain has to make a decision. Do you want me to have my core locked on, or do you want me to breathe into my belly? But I can't do both at once because it's opposite things. And so it's part of almost this human hard coding, right? Is that whenever we feel like we're under threat or pressure, we like to make ourselves look bigger. And you look at what happens to any mammal in nature, you know, comes up on its back feet, it kind of, you know, puffs up its chest, it wants to look intimidating and threatening. And humans are no different. And particularly when you've got a sport where you've got a whole lot of alpha males kind of, you know, around, and swimming is a classic as well as football, right? Is that you see this kind of upper chest, you know, this big breathing and all of this sort of stuff happening. And it actually means that you're already like heart rate's up and breathing's hard and fast before you actually get into game time or go time for our swimmers. And they're already, you know, their state, everything's kind of ramped up before they actually get into the go moment. What we actually want to try and do is go, how do we actually keep that under control so you've got that big thing to go into when you're really needing it, really needing to go.
Absolutely great explanation again. And this is why I got you on the podcast, because you explain things so simply. So thank you for that.
No.
I do want to, so I did say right at the start that we were going to go hard and talk about the Storm chat. We've done that. We've definitely done that. I just want to go all the way back to you now. So elite gymnast as well, yep. Commonwealth Games world champs, 6 years on the national team, if I've got that right.
Yeah, nice.
Why did you get into all this breathing and performance? What sort of sparked you to get after it and go down this road?
Yeah, awesome question. I used to have this mount that I would do onto the beam, and I don't know how much you listened about gymnastics with a rugby crowd, but the beam's about 10 centimeters wide, okay, yep. And it's not very wide. And it was often, for many gymnasts, and certainly myself, it was the one that I was most nervous about competing, because the margin of error is tiny. So you can't there's no room to really make a mistake. And I had a very difficult mount up onto the beam where I'd come in, kind of start, you know, a few meters back, and I'd come in forward facing, but I'd do a flip, land on a springboard at the end of the beam, and then somersault backwards and land on one leg. It was called a Yushenko. So I was blind entry, upside down to land on something that was 10 centimeters wide. And, you know, I could nail it in training 10 out of 10 times, you know, I actually quite enjoyed training it. It felt great. I could land it 10 out of 10 if it was a competition. It didn't really matter. If it was a big competition, I'd be on the beam, and then the next breath I'd be on the floor, right? And because my timing was off, and I just couldn't crack it. I worked with sports psychologists. I did all the right positive talk. Hey, you can do this. You know, you can do it. You know, blah blah blah. I went through the phase of going, don't fall off the beam, don't fall off the beam, don't fall off the beam, until some wise person said maybe try to stay on the beam. So that kind of helped a little bit, but I never really cracked it, and it cost me a medal. Certainly at Com Games, or at least an opportunity to make beam finals and then compete for a medal. Of course, nothing's a given. And I think that I always was like, how and why could I not crack that? Because physically I could do it. I had all the right visualization and self-talk and all the traditional psych, you know, skills that we often get taught in sports psych, you know. And I just couldn't crack it. So that really started this whole interest for me around performance under pressure. You know, I knew I wasn't a choker. I was a good competitor, but it was just this one thing that I just could never kind of crack. So then I started life as a sports physio, because I pretty much as a gymnast grew up in a physio clinic and just had this real interest in the physical performance side of sport. Did a lot of sport biomechanics, exercise physiology, studied a lot of other things. And then I was working in New Zealand, where I first was working, and I'd work as a normal sports physio at a sport medicine clinic that we'd sort of a lot of New Zealand's top athletes. And then twice a week I'd work at a clinic that dealt with panic attacks and breathing attacks, and very non-athletic population. And often I'd go into each clinic, and as it was the time for certainly, you know, 20 years ago with health and medicine, was a very siloed approach, right? I'd walk into the sports medicine clinic with my sports physio hat on. I'd walk into this breathing clinic with my breathing hat on, and not kind of really bring the two together. And it gradually dawned on me that I was actually seeing the same stuff. I was just treating it with blinkers on, you know, and there was a whole lot of stuff that was just falling through the gaps. And certainly 20 years ago, there wasn't anyone really working with breathing from a performance side of it, but especially with athletes. And that really, I think, helped me start to bring together that actually a lot of what was happening with breathing, with performance, was the physical side of what was changing with biomechanics and timing when we breathe differently. But then also having an understanding that's also really wound into that. And you can't separate the two around what happens with our mind and our experience of what's happening around us and our physiological stress response. So what I mean by the physiological stress response is we have a lot of, high performers, which I'm blessed to work with, around the world, who thrive under pressure. They love competition. They love big games. They love those big moments. They love that stuff. And they'll be like, no, I thrive under pressure and I love it. But there's not been a real understanding that actually your physiology is still going to have the stress response. So you can be calm up here mentally and emotionally, but your physiology in terms of what then changes to your heart rate and your breathing patterns in particular will start to elevate, which will change your biomechanics and your timing. Can you see, like, it probably sounds really confusing because it is actually so wound in together that it's really hard to kind of separate it all out.
No,
So
I totally. I probably just want to jump in. So I'm a big believer in, it's sort of something that has to be learned, is exactly what you're explaining, because I think so much of sort of old school coaching, especially when it comes to a skill, and we'll use goal kicking again, is the comment of just treat it like it's a training kick. But what you're explaining is how different state the body is in, what's happening. So I'm totally on board with everything you're saying.
And often that thing, let's treat it like a training kick, right? Is that's great in that moment. But what happened to, and I'm all about front loading stuff, right? And as I say to people all the time, this is a big part of what we're doing with the Storm, right? Is that performance under pressure is actually set up by everything you do away from that moment of pressure. And then this is going to show up. You can't wait until that big moment and then go, what is my little tweak, or what's my thing that I'm going to do in the moment of pressure? Because by then it's too late. Because by then everything has already escalated way too far up in terms of that, if I had some visuals, I could take you through this. It'd probably make a little bit more sense, where I talk about squiggly lines and red lines and, arousal states and thresholds, and, and it just makes sense, right? When you kind of understand that, if you can imagine, and I'll try and do it on screen and cut me off if I'm losing you, right? But basically we kind of, like, when I'm talking about, imagine that you're watching on a screen, and on one side there's the high arousal state, the fight and flight, right? Which is the heart rate goes up when that nervous system kicks in that says this is a threatening situation. We're either going to fight or we're going to run. But that cue makes us need to start breathing up here, because as far as our very old, primal, thousands of years old hard coding is concerned, we're about to try to fight for our life, or either a threat or a danger, even if it's a thought process. And this is where some of the links in between about what we think is just as important than what we're actually, if we're really in the environment, because our physiology doesn't understand the difference between really being in an environment and thinking about an environment. This all kind of shoots off, right? So we'll start breathing up here. Digestion shuts down because we're not worried about digesting the buffalo that we just killed if we're running away from a lion. Our muscles get a lot more tense, and mentally and emotionally we're a lot more kind of like reactionary, right? On the other side of that is our calm state, our what we call our rest and digest, or our parasympathetic nervous system, which is your heart rate will drop, your breathing will be in your diaphragm if you know how to do that, your digestion is wide open, your muscles are nice and relaxed, and mentally and emotionally you're really quite calm. And then I kind of draw a squiggly line in the middle of that, and it's a squiggly line because you can't be in both states at exactly the same time, because it has opposite effects on everything. So we're always, as humans, fluctuating. And often as athletes, the squiggly line, so to speak, was primarily thousands of years ago, we were designed to spend more time in the calmer nervous system and only use that fight and flight every now and then, right? Society is so busy, go, demands, overstim, like all sorts of stuff, that our squiggly lines spend a lot more time up near that high arousal state, where their point of being chilled out, relaxed and calm is not that far away from their point of high pressure. But they don't feel it, right? Because mentally and emotionally, they've still done the training, but they're not understanding that their physiology is still having this effect, okay? And then we talk about having a red line, whereas everyone's got a threshold that says, basically, as long as your squiggly line, as long as your arousal state stays below what your threshold is, you'll perform really well, like you'll thrive under pressure. But if you cross that line, that's when you have things like, you make dumb mistakes, you make tactical errors, you misread the field because your peripheral vision shuts down. So you don't see the wide open space, or you don't see that player, or whatever. Your technique tightens up because everything just becomes a lot more tense and rigid. So you lose your fluidity with, your kick or your swing or your pass or all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So you'll see physical stuff and emotional stuff.
just on this topic, what are some of the signposts that you ask athletes to look for? Because like this is all explained really well, and I completely understand it. I'm sure our listeners are. But again, in the moment, what are some of the things we can look out for that'll just tell us this is what's happening, this is how I can deal with it?
Yeah, that my squiggly line's getting too up.
No, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So specifically from a breathing perspective, or do you mean a whole performance perspective?
The whole thing, performance.
Yeah. Okay. So everybody's got a slightly different way of that showing up. And what I might even do, if it's helpful for you, I can send you through like some info that you can put, like if you've got some show notes or whatever, that will actually help rather than me rattle them all off in here. Yeah. But sometimes you'll notice it as the mind will start to go a little bit. So you lose mental clarity, like you lose that focus. You kind of feel like you just, I don't know, you've drifted somewhere, right? Yeah. You know, you're meant to be here, but you've drifted somewhere. Or a technique or a pass or a kick or you go, I know I can nail that in practice. Why do I keep stuffing that up? Why do I mistime that? Why do I rush to, get rid of the ball or rush that kick? Or, so often you'll see rushing on field. You'll see like almost a panicking, short, sharp movement that's not got that same fluidity. Yeah. You'll see things like off on field. You'll see lack of tolerance. So you'll lose your shit at the ref, or you'll get, you lose your shit at the other players when they make mistakes. You get quite verbal and quite in a way that you're not kind of normally that person,
Yeah,
or if you're you're more likely to throw a punch when things get a little bit of hand rather than being able to go, actually just step back, just de-escalate, right? So really reactionary, okay, is a good sign if you're starting to lose your temper. I often say to people, if a dickhead cuts you off in traffic on the way to a game or the way to practice, your reaction to that is going to give you a good indication about where you're at with your state. If you're like, oh, the dickhead, you know that it's probably you, even if they've done a dumb thing, right? Yeah. You should actually be able to stay calm enough that it's like, oh, dickhead or whatever, right? Move on. But if you have an over exaggerated reaction to something, that's probably the best one. The best thing is if you have an overblown reaction to something that's actually not a big deal, that's probably a good indicator that you're quite up. You're starting to kind of get to, hey, my pressure release valve is about to go somewhere. Yep. In terms of the breathing stuff, then things like, difficulty feeling like you're getting enough air into your chest, feeling like you're having to come off the field more often to sub, you're fitter than that, but you're constantly having to come off and take some time on the bench, difficulty catching breath after a sprint or after intensity, or the same stuff we're talking about with kicking, you're suddenly mistiming where you go, I know I can nail that kick all the time in a game, in a practice scenario, and you're not getting it in a game. There's some stuff going on there. Is that the sort of stuff that you're after?
Yeah, I was just wondering then, do you get athletes to watch back their performance and instead of just watching for the technical skill part, watch and sort of rate themselves on their arousal level, their posture, all their sort of breathing techniques? Do you get them to actually watch for the performance on that side of things?
Yeah, and it's amazing how you would take for granted that that's just something that people would do. Hey, but but often so focused on the technical tactical. And then if there's technical tactical errors, they think that's where the improvement has to happen. But actually, it's the technical tactical error probably, it's only happening under pressure. So therefore, it's not the technique or the tactical side of it that's actually the problem. It's your ability to handle or ability to tap into the same state that you can still execute under pressure. Because executing under pressure just takes two things. One, can you execute to your physical potential? And two, can you control your arousal state? Now, if you can do both of those at the same time, particularly because they're so wound into each other, right, then you can perform under pressure. But if you lose control of one of those things, or even more importantly, if you've never trained any of those, all you've done is the technical tactical training, you're leaving everything to chance, right? You actually haven't intentionally gone, how do I learn how to perform under pressure? Because it's actually a thing in and of itself. Many people, especially, I think we've talked about this a little bit before, but especially, in the lifestyle that we live now, maybe different in the last year, but certainly pre-COVID, most of us weren't comfortable being uncomfortable. You know, we had such a comfortable life, right? We didn't like being uncomfortable. And even when I get professional athletes to you know, who use the ice bath, for example, right, as a physical recovery strategy. It happens when you get an ice bath, and I don't know if you use them or if your listeners do. Some of the probably high level certainly will use it. First thing that happens is that the lizard brain kicks in and goes, oh, this is I want to get out of here. This thing's a threat. It's going to kill me, right? It's cold. It's uncomfortable. It's not fun, especially in the middle of winter, right? Hands under the armpits for recovery, but that's an awesome opportunity for them to actually learn how to control their state and go, oh, my reaction to being uncomfortable is I tense up my breathing, I hunch up my shoulders, and my brain goes, please get out of here, this sucks, and that whole kind of victim mindset, right? But if you can actually learn to go, okay, well, there's that reaction, it's cold and everything tenses up, but then I'm actually going to just relax my shoulders, I'm going to breathe out, and I'm going to slow my breathing just into my belly. It doesn't have to be counted or holds or anything, it's literally just normal relaxed breathing. The cold's still going to be there, and it's still going to be cold and unpleasant. But what you're training yourself to do is go, this is how I've actually trained myself to take control of my state when I'm uncomfortable and when that reaction's kicked in. Now, the more times that they can do that in practice, and, you know, especially for our pro athletes, when they might be in the ice bath 3 to 4, 5 times a week even, there's 3 to 5 opportunities in a week that they can practice how to control their state so it shows up for them in games, as opposed to in a professional season. You've only got so many game opportunities to, first of all, work out how do I react when I am in a high pressure environment, and then B, learn to try to, you know, mitigate some of that. And in a game situation, you've got other priorities. And so, you know, so you actually haven't intentionally trained yourself to go, cool, there's my reaction. This is how I take control of it. If you don't have access to an ice bath, you can do it in a cold shower just as well. So first thing in the morning, get up, get in the cold shower, watch what happens mentally when you try to negotiate with yourself about, oh, maybe not today, or oh, I'll stay in bed another 5 minutes and somehow it'll get warmer, or you'll turn on the cold water, and you literally have to almost, there's no part of you, once you've made that commitment to what that this is what I'm going to do, it's amazing how your brain will try to negotiate for you to not do it, right? And even that shows you a lot about yourself when you go, wow, okay, I really don't like being uncomfortable. Well, magic happens when you're uncomfortable, because magic happens outside your comfort zone, right? And by definition, being outside your comfort zone feels uncomfortable. But if you haven't learned how to go, I'm okay with this, and I know how my body and my mind reacts, and even more importantly, I've trained myself to bring that all back down and under my control, it's going to have control of you, and you're just at its mercy. Right. The anxiety before a game's not going to go anywhere. That, you know, the anxiety that you feel, the butterflies before a big kick, is probably still going to be there. The difference is you've learned how to recognize, oh, there's that feeling, and here's how I bring it back down again.
Yeah. The geez, you give me so many different
I know, I'm
ways
so
I can go down. But it's fantastic. I love it. I love listening to someone who gets so excited about it, and you definitely are. You mentioned there about the magic happening when you're uncomfortable, and I think that's why it's so satisfying when you come off the field after a big moment, big pressure, and you do execute a skill, you nail a kick, or I keep going back to that kicking example. So that's the best one. But I also think, as we spoke about with the Wallaroo girls, is them coming from a club field where they are dominant, they know they're the best players, they execute, onto then, you know, an international game where, okay, there's a lot more pressure here. And quite often you see the blank faces turn up, you see the body language is completely different. They're a completely different being on the field. So I want to go all the way back. So you could nail your move. I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah.
Nice. You can nail that 10 from 10 in training. How did you, or did you have the opportunity to execute that in a high pressure situation? How did you get through it?
Yeah, I did have an opportunity. So Com Games was a good example of that. And I fell. And so that was, as I said, that was the thing that kind of made me go, because I didn't have this knowledge and learning as an athlete, right? Because we were never taught this stuff. It was basically the philosophy, and I'd like to think sports changed, but I think in many ways it probably hasn't, is it was train the skill, get good at the skill, and then hope that it shows up when you need it, you know? And I say to people all the time, hope is a shit strategy. Like, you actually have to intentionally set up high performance, you know? And so, you know, coming to those girls, like, you know, it's kind of like often, and I see this a lot. I felt this certainly as an athlete, but man, I see it all the time in teams that I work with. And we're talking professional, top level teams. and attitude of I deserve to win. Yeah. And it's kind of like, oh, we've won all of these games, we've done all the training, we've worked hardest in pre-season, whatever it is, we deserve to win. And I'm like, you don't deserve anything. Like you've earned the right, even if you've won the majority of the games through regular season, or you've become this awesome athlete at club level, coming back to your example, you've earned the right to show up to compete. But now if it's it's grand final, right? You've earned the right to be there, but now you have to go out and execute. There's none of this kind of deserving stuff going on, because often athletes get lulled into that false sense of security, which I think I probably did as an athlete. Oh, I've done all the training, I've done my 10 out of 10, so therefore it should just show up, rather than, well, actually, have I really, because I look back now as a gymnast, I never really tested myself in training to try to reproduce that feeling of, hey, this is a big moment, or this really counts, or certainly I would train, and if our coach wasn't there, I'd be the person who'd still be training. I wasn't the one to always looking to cut the corners, but I didn't like being uncomfortable. So if it was something that I didn't really, or I had some fear of, or I knew it was a weakness, I wouldn't necessarily push myself to be uncomfortable with it, to train for it. So I think there's this kind of this coming to your club level athletes that then go on into an international, man, that's a huge gap that they're trying to bridge. And you can use all the positive self-talk in the world that you like to go, oh, I know I can do it. We've got this, girls, we can, whatever that is. But actually your brain and your physiology knows you're lying to yourself, and that actually creates more of a mistrust. And I'm not sure that I can actually do this, because there's this false self-talk, be positive, be positive, be positive. But there's nothing to support that, because you haven't done the work for that, right? And then, of course, you don't get the result, and then you're disappointed and you gut it, and that's when you lose confidence. Rather than going, well, what do we actually need to do to strategically set ourselves up for success, and even more importantly, success under pressure, because that's when the big moments are, right? And if you strategically do that, then you're giving yourself the best fighting chance. But you actually have to be intentional and plan for it, which is, coming back to your question about the Storm, which is some of the stuff that impresses me, that they intentionally look to do that. The All Blacks, look to do that. And there's no surprise that these guys are some of the best people in the world.
Yeah. You will have heard from the All Blacks about the whole blue and red state of thinking. And sure. I'm thinking of, I had great experiences with teammates who were experienced, were comfortable. And I probably, when I first come into playing, thought, man, they're chilled on the field. Are they, how seriously are they actually taking this? And now that I'm a little bit older, come to realize, no, that was them being able to perform and, stay calm, breathing, all the things you're talking about. So as a teammate, how can you help another teammate out? Like, what are some strategies and ways, or things even as an individual I can say to a teammate who I trust or a good friend in the team, hey, can you help me out if you see this? Cue it.
Yeah, and I think actually you've just answered it yourself, right? Because it depends on whether, you're working with a team. So let's take the Melbourne Storm, for example, where they all are familiar with the cues, right? They know what to look for in each other. So if they see one of their teammates doing something that they know is an indicator, they will give them a cue to go to as a reminder. And they've worked out the words that they want to use for that. And that's kind of all their terminology, right? Versus if you're just working with one individual in the team and the other teammates have no idea kind of what's going on, then it's not going to work so well. So I think it's exactly as you said. It's actually an individual athlete or player having a conversation with someone in their team and going, hey, when you see me, start to make mistakes or start to do whatever, just remind me that, like, I keep coming back to breathing, and part of me is like, oh, there's that breathing lady talking about breathing. Right? I do so much more than that. But it literally is just such that it's a direct hack. You know how I was talking about that squiggly line stuff, right? The three hacks between being in that high arousal state, right, versus the one that can lead you to flow, is where you breathe to, where you look, and what you're thinking. And so what I mean by that is that fight and flight nervous system one will make you breathe shallow, your peripheral vision shuts off, and you're very into scarcity mindset. It's basically just don't die. Okay, now it's a modern version of that. Don't miss the kick, don't stuff up. What if we don't make final? Whatever that version is. But basically, it's don't die. Okay, in terms of a primal human. The other one, the flow state nervous system, if that one's turned on, then you breathe into your belly, your peripheral vision's wide open, and you can actually have gratitude. Okay, without sounding all rainbows and unicorns. Yeah. And so if you're where you start to go yourself and you go, man, I'm starting to to kind of escalate, and I can feel the pressure coming in, and you've got a choice. You can either buy into that and you go, oh man, I'm really feeling the pressure. Oh, what if? Or you can take that mental control and you can go, okay, hang on a sec. Breathe into my belly, and just 3 breaths into your belly will switch that calmer nervous system on. These are your get out of jail cards, but they work. Is 3 breaths into your belly. Actually consciously think about bringing your peripheral vision online. So if you're a kicker and you feel like you get that tunnel vision, everything's, almost oppressing and it's coming in on you, actually to either just soften your gaze somewhere out behind the goalpost, or just step back and just be aware of your peripheral vision, and actually having one gratitude thought that you've trained yourself to think in that moment. Because again, think like a primal human. If you're running away from a lion, you're not going, I'm so grateful for this opportunity, right? So the two don't go together. Is that you have those that little scan, okay, 3 breaths into my belly, or whatever it is, peripheral vision, gratitude thought. Those 2 things actually trick everything about you to think, hey, I'm actually safe. And all of this, so much of this comes back to us just as our primal humanness, okay? And if you can cue those 3 inputs to go, actually, we're safe, there is no threat, then funnily enough, you can just de-escalate stuff just a couple of, kind of notches of arousal, kind of back down to performance state, and then you can execute. And that little technique, you can do that in like 10 seconds when you've drilled it really well. But you can't go out into a grand final and use it for the first time and expect it's going to work. So that's where some of that ice bath training, for example, is really effective. That's where some of the running, getting breathless on the field, and then try to execute some of those things can really work. Or if it is a competition or a game that's not actually a big deal, drill that. Okay, this is my performance hack. So that you've used it and practiced it in those lower threat states, I guess, so it's there when you need it, because you're not going to be consciously thinking of it. You're going to be doing other, you've got other priorities in that moment.
I love that sort of explanation you used about just taking things down a few notches. I think it makes a lot of sense in my brain, and probably a guy who I learned from, Lima Sopawanga, he told me an example that he used for the All Blacks when he was goal kicking, about finding someone in the crowd, looking at their T-shirt and trying to identify what logo their T-shirt was. And when I was younger, I was like, that is stupid. I've got to kick a goal. I'm not doing something waste of time like that. But it's got nothing to do with that task. It's about taking things down a few notches.
And that's what I was talking to you, just when I was just going back to what I was talking to you about, those 2 states in the squiggly line, right, and your red line, right? And as long as your arousal state is, and everyone's got a different threshold, so as long as your arousal state is below what your threshold is, then none of the bad stuff that, the negatives of what can happen to people under pressure, none of that shows up. But if you are living life with your squiggly line butting up against red line all the time, because life is stressful, you're overdoing your tax returns, you've had issues with your girlfriend, you've got, you're worried about contract that year, you've got all of this negative stuff around fear of not being good enough. What if I don't make the team? What if I don't, like all of this messiness in life, right? Your squiggly line before you even take the field is butting up against red line, right? And so then when you get the normal arousal state, because now it's game time, that normal arousal state just pushes you across your threshold, and that's when you see the bad stuff show up. And that's where we see athletes that are labeled all the time as chokers, like they don't perform well under pressure. And that's what I mean about, it's not actually their skill it's the problem. It's probably everything in life that's pushed their squiggly lines so far up before they take the field, and then that's just where it shows up. It shows up under pressure, right? But if you do a whole lot of all of this other stuff, so some of it's breathing, some of it's all of the other sort of, life performance, humanness stuff that we often talk about, is that then you've got your squiggly line, you've got a buffer in the system. So when you get the normal couple of arousal notches that, hey, it's game time, or this is a final, or I've gone from club level to international, or whatever it is, you've got room in the system that, yes, and that's what I mean, you're still going to feel the anxiousness, you're still going to feel the nerves, you're still going to feel like, oh my God, it's a big moment, but it's not going to cross into the danger zone of when stuff starts to go sideways for you. And so that's kind of what we talk about just, can you notch things down a little bit, so that's actually your start point, so you've got room in the system, whereas everyone kind of tries to go, let's just fix the problem way up here, and it's not consistent enough.
Yeah, absolutely nailed that explanation again. I want to change tack. We've got 3 more things I want to talk to you about. So the unpaid professional, a bit of victim mentality, but before we go into that, I want to talk about the Golden State experience, and probably out of the work that you did is just as a professional coach, like what were some of the things you saw and experienced stepping into Golden State? I'm interested.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And I was in a really, like that's a great question, because I'm like, where do I start with that, right? So I had quite a unique experience. I was brought in originally as a guest with the
What
high
year was
performance coach
this?
at the
Sorry, by the
time.
way. What year?
2016,
Wow.
I think. I don't know if it's 15, 16 or 16, 17. Like, so it's a bit blurry, right? So it might have been 16. It was the year that Coach Kerr had to take some time off coaching.
Wow.
Whatever season that was. And I'd been asked by the high performance guy just to go, who was familiar with my work, could you come in and just kind of have a look? And I really want to get you involved in the program, but I'm still getting a feel for it. So I just happened to be in the States at the time. So I called in, and as individuals, they wanted some performance under pressure help with some things. So I ended up not working with the whole team as a whole. I was working with a couple of key individuals for a couple of certain periods of time to achieve some results. And I have to be careful what I say because of privacy and confidentiality around who these people were. And that's something obviously I take really seriously, is not kind of giving too much away about individuals, as you can appreciate. But I mean, a couple of standouts was it was this weird bubble, right? It's like,
I think we're all just waiting for you to say Steph Curry, but carry on.
he was an impressive human, right? And one of the things I'll say about him, and I use him often all the time, is that story that most people are really familiar with Steph, where he was always told he wasn't going to be big enough or strong enough to be a basketball player, right? To be an NBA player. And he could have easily bought into that and gone, yep, it's not fair. I'm not. But and that's what I kind of call the victim mindset, which you might, I know you touched on that just before, but we see often athletes will go to all the time. It's not fair. Fill in the dots. This is the reason I can't perform, or this is the reason I don't make my team, or whatever. Instead, he was like, well, how can I become good enough to become an NBA player? And I don't know that this was inside his head, but as a uneducated observer looking at him, he was like, well, I can get really good at a 3-point shot, worked really, really hard at it, and obviously become a phenomenal player. And that was one thing early on that he was really well known for, was his 3-point shooting, and just phenomenal with it, right? And one of the things I watched after every practice session that I was just blessed enough to be in the training facility to watch was he would drop 100 3-pointers before he'd leave the court, right? He was the best in the world at the time, and yet still had that work ethic to go, how can I get better? And it was that difference between excellence and perfection. It wasn't I'm not good enough, and it was more that I want to get better, and I want to learn, I want to grow, and I want to keep becoming more excellent to keep that edge. So that work ethic was phenomenal, and just what a humble human he was, for someone who's actually a superstar. And I think that's the stuff that, and we've talked about before, but that awesomeness and true high performers, just how humble they actually are versus some of the guys in, whatever, in the team. And often that was just to mask some insecurities, I think. Often you see and hear the noisiest person in a room is usually the most insecure, right? So, so that was kind of some interesting, just to watch those dynamics of how they work. I think the joy that they had in terms of practice was a big thing. They seemed to really love practice. It wasn't all about games and the drudgery of it all. So
I hear Steve Kerr speak about that,
but also
a lot.
just that
the having to have joy in the training and in the practice.
I mean, and it's some of that ties back into what we're talking about, even about those, coming back to that squiggly line analogy with the two states, right? Is that if you're in that higher, that's a fear-driven state, right? You don't get optimal performance when there's fear. So if you've got coaches that are yelling it all the time, gymnastics in New Zealand has obviously just gone through that review process, and gymnastics globally about some of the coaching practices, it's quite abusive. You don't bring out your best in performance, and we're seeing it in many sports actually across the globe, right, that are starting to come out, especially in New Zealand with the number of independent inquiries that they've had, is that you don't actually get the best out of athletes when they're in a fear-driven state. You might get a reaction and a short change, but you don't get sustainable long-term high performance. Whereas if you can tap them into that state, that's, hey, this is fun, this is joy, this is, you're shifting them more into that flow state, which is human behavior and everything, again, about our human hard coding is when we're not perceiving threats. That's when we grow, that's when we learn, that's when we expand, that's when we try stuff, that's when we flow, that's when just things work, because primal brain doesn't perceive there's a threat and something that we've got to survive. It's like, hey, there are no threats. This is growth time. And so that's, I think, what joy and fun and finding the things that you love about the sport, again, finding the things that you love about a practice session, or, you know, what you're saying before about you come off the field and you nailed that kick and it feels magic, you know, that's what keeps us coming back, right? Is that we chase that feeling. So I think that's a really critical part of training, you know, for coaches. It doesn't have to all be drudgery and seriousness and all those sorts of things.
Yeah. And I suppose just to the last thing on the Golden State, was there anything else that sort of really stood out for you about their environment?
Yeah, I think, and I don't know that it's a Golden State thing, so I want to be really, I want to preface that so it doesn't come across as critical of Golden State. It may well be just a US high performance sport thing or a NBA thing or whatever. Is it often, you know, how we're quite comfortable in Australia and New Zealand, our sports science is some of the best in the world, you know, coaching and often a team environment. They really do. They have awesome team doctors, you know, or physios or high performance people, or, you know, they've got a network of people around them, right? And there's usually a fair degree of trust between athletes and great working relationships, athletes, coaches, all of the personnel around high performance. Especially in a high performance team, you've got that trust and relationship, right? And I think that sport performance across the board is done exceptionally well down under. It felt like over in the States, like, so Australia and New Zealand does it really well and there's no money to spend on it, right? Yeah. In the States, it's kind of the opposite, right? There's things that's like, well, they don't do it so well, but they got a shitload of money. And it was interesting to see how many Australians and Kiwis were starting to infiltrate into some of the more performance roles in Australia and New Zealand. And I think that's awesome. But there also seemed to be a lack of trust where, you know, a player is almost like an individual commodity. And I guess that makes sense when they can be traded on a dime and they play for one team Friday and Monday they're kitted up for a whole different team because everything shifted, that they become a little bit more like these independent, almost contractors that have their support networks around them. And that can actually make, I think, some of the performance stuff, their job, difficult if there's not actually that trust, especially when the agent's getting in the player's ear going, well, actually you need a second opinion from this person or do this, and it's not the right or the best advice for the athlete, you know. So there was some complexities there that I was like, wow, you know, that I could imagine from an athlete's perspective how challenging that it's like, who do I trust? And it was certainly some of the things that, you know, some of these high profile NBA guys would be like, you know, that trust thing is so important. Who do I trust that's actually got my best interests at heart, not the team's best interests at heart? Which of course is what a lot of the pro teams are, and essentially it's a commercial entity, right? But there's a human behind that. There's a human behind that player, and that human gets affected by stuff, you know.
Perfect observation, and a really interesting as one as well about the sporting landscape. And you're right about the money thing, and it's awesome to see how many Aussies and Kiwis are popping up over in the States, and getting amazing opportunities. So I want to get into the unpaid professional. I know that you, with your gymnastics background, I can't believe you were on a huge contract when you were coming through, or any money similar to so many of the athletes coming through. And I think
you were surprised that we weren't. Did you say, or that we were?
Weren't. Yeah, I didn't think you were on any
just for clarity,
any payment. But I'm assuming that you took things really seriously, like a professional would, and had everything organised, training, and the rest of it. I feel like so many people at the moment are in such a rush. I suppose definitely in the women's game, to get paid and then I'll be professional. Once I get paid, I'll then perform. Once I get paid, I'll then be able to train and be ready. And I just am really interested, because I know you'll probably have the experience on this, and probably a point of view on just how people can be more professional, how they can find the joy and the passion and the love for it, and not have to get paid to be professional.
Wow, that's a great question. I think to put just a caveat on something like gymnastics is that we're quite young, right? So we're not having to. So I was 19 when I retired. For the majority of my gymnastics career, I was still at high school. I took a year off after high school because that was Con Games. I've been accepted into physio school, but I actually deferred for a year so I could just concentrate on training. I got a part-time job so that I could save some fees for uni. But, you know, really, you're not at an age where or traditionally, things are starting to change, I think, but you're not at an age where your sport career and your life career are having to somehow coexist. And so I think that in some ways that made it a little bit easier, because we wanted to be top of our game when we were very young, 17, 18. So we would be professional, and being paid for it wasn't even on the landscape, right? I think let's ring fence that for a young sport. I think in terms of older sports, I think it's for me is that thing about, many people wait until they feel different before they do different things, but actually you have to do different things in order to feel different. And so it comes, what you said before about that victim mentality. Oh, I can't be professional because I don't have money, or I can't be professional because of whatever, rather than going, well, how do I? How can I become professional? And I think you just see athletes who some get it and some don't. I think in terms of your mindset, doesn't cost any money. Okay. I think in terms of, have you done your preparation in terms of, do you look after your body? Do you stretch, do you roll out, do you do your core, do you do like whatever that off-field preparation stuff, do you do that? That doesn't necessarily take a lot of money to do, there's awesome stuff online. But are you taking yourself seriously? Are you treating yourself as a professional in terms of how you show up? And I think that, to me, that comes to that standard of excellence, right? Is if you have a personal standard of excellence, then you're going to look at, how can I be excellent at everything that I do? My preparation, my nutrition, my mindset, how I treat others around me, the respect that I have for teammates, all of that sort of stuff. That's just a standard of excellence. And I think that philosophy of how you do one thing is how you do everything. And I say to athletes all the time, if you want excellence on the field, you can't just hope that shows up. Here's that hope's a shit strategy thing again, right? You can't just hope that excellence shows up at game time if you're not actually living excellence everywhere else in your life. And notice I say excellence, not perfection. So it's actually about having that mindset straight off the bat to go, well, if I don't live excellence for myself, if I don't take myself, and I don't mean seriously, but do you know what I mean? If I don't take myself as a professional, then how can I possibly expect anyone else to? Has that answered your question or not really? Have I just gone on a big rant?
Absolutely. The reason I paused was because I think that our link paused, so I wasn't too sure whether you were finished. I love the word excellence as well, and so right about how you do the small things is how you do everything, is another way of putting it. So absolutely nailed it. And I suppose that ties into it really well. And we spoke about it on the sideline about a little bit of the victim mentality. And it seems I must have listened to a podcast or heard something come out about it, and it's definitely on trend at the moment about victim mentality. And when you understand it, it's so obvious how people are talking, how people are communicating, and how quickly it can spread through a team as well.
Oh, wow. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I suppose you had a great explanation about why it's even a thing. Why do we act
what
the
was
victim?
My explanation?
It was about it was back to
I was in the flow, Peter.
Yeah, exactly. It was about in your community, so I suppose your tribe in the cave, about how we had to be agreeable and help each other survive.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So you can just tell that story, right?
It was your story.
And look, a pure human behavior scientist is probably going to totally pull this apart, right? But often I find coming back to sort of just basic humanness about how we probably used to operate as humans, thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago, whatever, is that as humans before the modern world that we live in, we couldn't survive as an individual, right? We didn't have the physical strength to defend ourselves against big predators, and we didn't have the ability to hunt and gather a sufficient food source for ourselves, usually just on our own. So we were quite reliant on our tribe literally for survival. Okay. And so part of our hard coding within all of that is about making sure that we fit in with our tribe. We don't want to get thrown out from our tribe, because that literally was a death sentence for us. If we were cast out, then it was so it's a survival instinct for us to want to fit in with others. And that's why we have such a fear of missing out, or a fear of what other people think, is so driven into so many athletes and humans across the board, right? But again, it comes from that same thing of, I need to fit in with my tribe so I don't get thrown out, because getting thrown out is a death sentence. So, I think the analogy I used with you, and I'm hesitant to say it on a podcast in case I get slaughtered by that's a sexist thing, this whatever, right? So I'm not saying that, but I think, traditionally, again, men in the tribe were physically stronger, so they were more, they go out as an independent, they would go solo hunting or whatever. The women more were the gatherers and the stay closer to the home environment, and they had to work together because they had to communicate where the best berries were on the bush, because you might get taken by the lion one day and the other tribes people needed to know where it was, right? So there was a lot, especially I think a lot more with females, there tended to be even more of that kind of communication and bonding and sharing the same thought processes or wanting to be agreeable, whereas often we see males are more willing to have their strong, independent, solo view a little bit. And I can hear all the criticism coming left, right, and center. You're being really sexist. I'm not intending it to be. But I think sometimes when you can just understand, wow, that's why when, we see it often with female athletes, and having worked with some female athlete teams before, one person gets the shits with a coach, or they'll be like, oh, this, trains too hard. This is being, this is shit, or, they're not happy with something. That is more likely to become a bit of a toxic part of the culture and conversation, because everyone, oh yeah, did you see what, and it's a lot of that more kind of gossipy agreeableness, which is so just wound into, it's not a male female thing, it's just in our DNA, right? Versus I think sometimes you see in male teams, if someone's being a dickhead, their teammates are more likely to say, hey, you're being a dick, pull your head in, and it's not taken personally, whereas it tends to be a little bit more so with them if they're not aware of what might be driving some of that.
Yeah. And you've definitely earned the right to have a viewpoint on this stuff. So don't feel like you are speaking out of turn. And I guess the other thing that brought on this conversation was we spoke about understanding that behavior, but what are we actually here to do? Like, we are here to win a game, a competitive game, high performance. We aren't just here to survive. We actually are here. And you explained really well about how professionals and people that want to reach the top can't live in the middle with their the ends with their behavior. They have to be in an anonymly. Jesus, that word's tough.
Anomaly, an anomaly, and exactly. And I think, and thank you, because that actually probably, just thinking about how we're hardwired as males versus females, in terms of just DNA, right? In terms of hard coding survival instincts as humans, as Homo sapiens. Is it just because that's the hard coding that was a survival instinct from thousands of years ago doesn't mean that's how we have to show up, right? We just have to be aware of, oh, well, that's kind of what my more natural go-to response is, but it doesn't mean that has to define me. I can go, cool, as soon as I'm aware of it, oh, that's why I do X, Y, Z. I'm going to choose a performance behavior instead, rather than being catty or bitchy or negative or gossipy or, whatever. And I've certainly worked with some toxic female teams that started as very toxic female teams. They didn't actually even were aware that that's what they were doing, right? And it was as soon as it was like, have you stepped off this and looked at, does it actually make you feel better about yourself? And do you think that actually makes your teammate feel better about yourself? And this is a male and female thing, right? But do you think it makes your teammate feel better about yourself? And if the answer to that is no, and yet you're seeking high performance, then why are you consciously choosing actions, thoughts, and behaviors that are detracting from high performance? They're actually taking you in the opposite direction. And sometimes it's simple as just having that conversation. It's like, oh, wow, I didn't actually think about that it was going to be that important. You want to be striving for all of your thoughts, actions, habits, and beliefs being intentionally aligned, that the natural outcome of those thoughts, habits, actions, and beliefs is taking you closer to high performance. And then anything that's actually taking you further away, you just kind of get rid of. You don't need to solve it. You don't need to, you just let it go, And so, in terms of that anomaly piece, you've got me going on it now. Absolutely, because that's certainly the up and coming athletes. I think once an athlete is on the international stage, they've been there for a while. They've got that confidence of, I know who I am. I'm all good with who I am, and I think that takes a degree of maturity to get to that point that you're just comfortable in your own skin. often when you're new and up and coming, you know, you're wanting to fit in, especially if you haven't yet made it into teams. You know, you're still at high school, for example, or you might be surrounded by, you know, your club athletes are a great example where you can compare yourself if you're at club level, but your aspiration is to be on the international stage. You can compare yourself to what your teammates at club level are doing and go, oh yeah, that's an okay standard for me to do that. Think that way, talk that way, act that way, treat other people that way, whatever it is about performance, right? But actually, you know, if we use height as an example, and you go, well, what's the average distribution of height across a population, right? And the average height across male population might be whatever it is. I don't know what it is. But if you want to be an NBA basketball player or you want to be an international elite gymnast, you're going to fall at one end of that normal distribution curve. You're not going to be of average height and be an NBA superstar, and you're not going to be of average height and be an Olympic gold medal male gymnast, right? There's going to be something that has you fall outside the norm. And so I think that the same philosophy with high performance and being a world-class athlete or a world-class team is that it's about being willing to do the stuff that isn't average, isn't normal, because by definition, if you're doing what is average, you're gonna be average. You know, you can't be best in the world and be average at the same time, because the two are complete opposite things just by statistics. Does that kind of make some sense?
100%.
And yet often as we're growing and developing as an athlete, we have a fear of standing out. Especially in New Zealand and Australia, with the whole tall poppy syndrome stuff, right? We don't want to be an anomaly. We don't want to be different from our peers or stand out from our peers. We keep wanting to seek back to being normal. So I often say to young and upcoming athletes is, don't look around necessarily, if you're still at club level, don't look around your schoolmates or your teammates if they don't have the same aspirations of you. That's, I want to be a world-class player, and I want to play for the All Blacks, I want to play for the Australian team, whatever it is, whatever sport, doesn't matter. But it's actually about use those people as your benchmark of what is excellence and outstanding, rather than your peer group that don't have the same aspirations. And there's no judgment. Of course they don't. Not everyone wants to be best in the world at what they do, and that's a good thing, probably, right? 100%. But you have to be okay about standing out, and that's why I often use the catchphrase "be outstanding." Be outstanding in terms of excellence, in terms of that, but actually just be comfortable being outstanding and falling outside of average.
Yeah.
And I think that goes for coaches, and I think that goes for leadership as well. It comes from executive teams, it comes from boards, it comes from all of that. If you want to be world class, you have to have leadership that's willing to have those same standards around excellence and being outstanding from just normal.
Yeah. Wow. We've mainly spoke about the athlete, and you just mentioned right at the end coaches and leadership, but we're not going to go into that. That's
sorry.
Amazing. Sorry, hey, Rachel, that was outstanding. So that wraps us up. But I think throughout that whole conversation, there is so many little gems, ways of thinking, little things that I know are going to spark so many people to think about and how that they can apply to their own game, whatever they're doing, coaching or playing, trying to be the best that they can be. And you're so right about that last thing about if you're doing average things, you will be average. And I think so many people that are listening to our podcast are not trying to be average.
Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I will definitely have some show notes with some more content, but is there anything that you sort of want to wrap up with?
Oh, no, I mean, just thank you for having me on, and I hope I haven't gone off on too many random tangents. I think that there are so many directions that we could have gone down. Hey, happy if any of your listeners want to reach out, if this has given them any questions or anything. I'm on Facebook. I don't post a whole lot, but I'm certainly very approachable. I do tend to be a bit of a fly under the radar and just get shit done behind the scenes rather than out, in public a lot. So can be a little bit hard to find. So more than happy for people to connect on Facebook or my email address as well. Feel free to put that in the show notes if anyone wants to reach out, any questions or anything like that. So happy to.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think we all can hear the passion on any little tangent we went down in your voice. So it's really fun to chat. So thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. See you, Peter. Bye.